Hello, everyone. Welcome to this conversation on the first response to freedom. Today, we're going to be looking at how we responded to freedom, the initial response to what it was going to look like to be a free biracial society in America after 250 years of slavery. It's a really tough question, a really tough situation, and I think the way people responded is going to tell us a lot about what things would look like going forward. So in this conversation, we're going to look at three things. We're going to look at presidential reconstruction. What was the view of the presidents on what a free biracial society would look like? And then we're going to look at the black codes, the reasons for them, the rights established by them, the restrictions in them, and the enforcement and duration of them. And we're trying to understand what was the Southern response. How did Southerners respond initially to freedom? And then lastly, we're going to look at how the church responded. And in particular, we'll look at the rise of the black church. So this map reminds us of the fact that America was a tremendously divided nation at the time of emancipation, and that ultimately we ended up through the Civil War without any sort of national consensus. We end up getting freedom. We have Emancipation Proclamation and we have the slaves freed. There's not a tremendous plan about what things would look like after the slaves were freed. It was done for military reasons. And then ultimately that raises all kinds of questions. Are freed slaves going to have citizenship? Are they going to have basic civil rights? Are they going to have political rights, the right to vote? What are we going to do with regard to land? Are they going to be able to have their own land? How are we going to deal with that issue? And ultimately, in the broader context over several conversations, what we're going to see is that the ultimate answer to that was no, they're not going to have land. They're going to be sharecroppers. No, they're not going to live equally in society with the rights that everybody else has. There's going to be segregation. And no, they're not going to have political rights. They're going to be disfranchised. And so that's the picture. The map helps us to see the confusion at the time of the war, how there were free states in the Union, there were states in the Union that were slave states, there were southern states that left the Union, there were territories that had not been settled yet. There was a western portion of the country. But the point I want to make here is, in general, there is no plan to what freedom is going to look like, what a free biracial society will look like. That's not how things transpired to bring an end to slavery. So I want to start with the question, what would you expect a free biracial American society to look like? Based on what you know, based on 2.5 centuries of slavery, of one race owning millions of people ultimately as their slaves. What would you expect a free biracial American society to look like? How do we do that here? It's a very complicated and very difficult question. Jodi Picoult, in her book Small Great Things, said, most of us think the word racism is synonymous with the word prejudice. But racism is more than just discrimination based on skin color. It's about who has institutional power. It's also about who has institutional power and how they can use that power against another group of people. So Picoult raises a really, really important issue here. Who did have the institutional power at the end of the Civil War? Even though slavery had been brought to an end, who had the institutional power? And the truth is, white Americans had the institutional power, and most of those white Americans did not believe in a free biracial society that was equal. That's the reality of this period, and those people had institutional power. So the first people to speak into this were our presidents, and Abraham Lincoln, as you know, died towards the end of the Civil War, right before the end, and was succeeded then by Andrew Johnson. And these two presidents really formulated a very, very lenient idea of what it would look like to put the country back together again. The word Reconstruction really is a word that we use to classify the period from 1865 to about 1877 because it's that time in which the government was tasked with putting the country back together again, reconstructing the country. The country had been torn apart by civil war. 11 states had left the Union or said they left the Union. How do we bring them back in? There's important questions like they're going to start voting again. They're going to start electing representatives again. They're going to start influencing legislation. What is that going to look like? What is reconstructing the country going to look like? Lincoln's plan that he put forward in 1863 said to bring a state back into the Union and allow them to have full representation, we need 10% of their citizens to take a loyalty oath. We are going to issue lots of pardons for people, obviously, that fought against the Union. We are going to, people will have to agree to emancipation, have to agree to freedom, and we're going to argue generally that they never really left the Union. So very lenient idea of what Reconstruction looks like. Notice from Lincoln's perspective, no plan for equality, just freedom. No plan for equality. This is not surprising based on the quote we shared before about the 1858 quote of Lincoln. He never stood for equality of the races. He didn't make that argument then. He's not making that argument in 1863. Johnson's plan was to say we don't need a loyalty oath. He kind of issued blanket pardons to all except the very wealthiest Southerners who he made come to him in person to get a pardon. He said ratify Amendment 13, which is the amendment ending slavery. And he also decided to return confiscated lands that the Army had confiscated from Confederates and return them to them rather than to give them away to the freed slaves, which is a question at this time. So very lenient ideas, neither of which address the issues of equality that would have to be addressed to have an effective answer to the question of what a free biracial society would look like. So why did Southerners feel black codes were necessary? So the next part of our conversation deals with the Southern response. What was done in the South immediately following the war to deal with the question of a free biracial society? And what was done was the creation of a system of laws, a separate criminal justice system, essentially, for freed blacks. And it was termed the Black Codes. Why would Southerners feel something like this was necessary? Why would they think black codes were necessary? A separate criminal justice system for black Americans. Brenda Salter McNeil, in her excellent book, Becoming Brave, helps us to kind of understand the context of this. She said, in the subtle but subversive act of eating together, we recognize and uphold the truth that what one person hungers for is ultimately what all people hunger for. It embodies the human bond between us, admitting that your needs are my needs. In doing this, we recognize that we are all made in the image of God and are worthy of being treated with dignity and respect. This is why white people refused to let their slaves eat with them. They could not bear the fact that they all were equally made in the image of God. I think McNeil makes a critical point that's necessary for us to understand, and that is in the world of slavery, the white slave owner lived in very close contact with their slaves. There was a lot, they went to church together. They lived on the same land together. They worked in the same buildings and in the same fields together. But it's really important to note they didn't eat together. White slave owners made it clear that black slaves were different to them in their view. And they said, we're not going to eat with them because eating is like a leveler. It brings people together socially. It says, hey, we're the same. We eat, we share together. We're all made in the image of God with the same basic needs. White people, white slave owners would not do that. So in trying to look at why would they write black codes, why would they create a separate criminal justice system? Because they didn't want to eat together, because they didn't want to live free and equally together. They didn't see that as a possibility, and they didn't want that for themselves. So they wrote black codes. The reasons for the black codes were, number one, the need to replace the slave codes. The slave codes that existed under slavery were the way slaves were governed. Now you have millions of people that the criminal justice system itself was not established to deal with. That the criminal justice system in existence in the South was for whites. It wasn't for slaves and now free black people. And so they said, we're going to create a separate code because we have to. We have to have some kind of way to control this population. They also did it to stabilize the workforce, to stabilize the labor force, to stabilize black labor. We have to understand that the white Southerner was completely dependent on the black Southerner for labor. That was critical. The whole system didn't work. The whole economic system of the South is destroyed without black labor at this time. And so they wanted to stabilize the labor force, stabilize black labor, and also control it to limit the economic options of black workers so they can control them and so their economy could function as closely as possible to the way it functioned in a slave society. The rationale for these codes was the idea of innate racial inferiority, the idea that one race was superior to the other, and that inferiority within the black race was innate. The word innate simply means something that comes with a person, something that's connected to them, something that's natural to them. Sometimes we would refer to this as genetic. It's in your genes, it's in who you are, it's in your DNA. It is innate. Your inferiority is innate. The superiority of the other race, the white race, is innate to them. So the rationale is we don't have any choice. This is the natural way things are, so there must be two separate systems. What's the motivation? The motivation was fear. We've talked about this before. Fear that in freedom and equality, that black Americans would kill white Americans, would revolt against them. It's control. It's a desire to maintain control over a group of people that you formerly controlled. It's a new method of control. And then lastly, it's a new method of exploitation. It's a desire, as we've seen from the beginning, as we've talked about slavery, it's a desire to control a group of people in order to exploit them for their labor. So the Black Codes paint a pretty dismal picture of the reality of the situation after the war ended in the South. But there's also a positive element to the Black Codes, and we need to understand that. There are certain rights that the Black Codes granted to Black Americans that they never had before in the South. The right to marry, the right to legally marry, that did not exist in slavery. The right to make a contract, the right to testify in court. Now, it was restricted. You can only testify in court cases involving other Black Americans, but you could testify in court. The right to own your own property and the right to sue and be sued in court. So there are certain rights. They're very limited. But it's important to know there is some progress made by the Black Codes. But it's also important, I think, to realize, because it's a sobering thing to realize that these things didn't exist prior to the 1860s. So the Black Codes created something called the labor contract. It was a series of work restrictions, essentially, that were designed to control the labor force, as we said. The Black Codes labor contracts required that every Black person in the South in January show written evidence of employment for the coming year. So they had to go get a labor contract with someone to work for them, and they had to be able to show that labor contract, and it was a requirement within the law. The purpose was to maintain control and to keep blacks from being idle and to get them committed so they can't move from place to place. It's to control them. It's to get them in one location working for an entire year for one person. You can see that control in the fact that they were barred in many places from anything but farming, except unless they paid an annual tax. So if you want to do something other than farming in some parts of the South, you had to pay a tax in order to be allowed to work a different job. They were subject to arrest by any white citizen. This white citizens could um, enforce the black codes and the labor contract. They found a black American without a labor contract, you could be arrested by that white citizen. And whites themselves were fined for offering work to somebody already under contract. So they didn't want whites competing for black labor because that empowers black labor. So it's a system of control. We saw that exploitation, control. The black codes also had attached to them vagrancy laws. People were fined for not having uh, a contract, a labor contract. If you didn't have a job, you're fined. And the definitions of all these different fines associated with vagrancy laws included being idle, being disorderly, misspending your money even could be a reason for being fined under the vagrancy laws. So the black codes also had a provision for child apprenticeships. This meant that a judge could bind black orphans and those whose parents were unable to support them to white employers. So if you were an orphan or they couldn't find your parents, or your parents didn't have a job, a judge could say, all right, we're going to put you into a labor contract with as an apprentice with on a plantation. And a lot of times the former owners are the ones that got these children. No consent from the parents was required. They were allowed to do corporal punishment with these kids. Thousands upon thousands of children were bound to these apprenticeships without the consent of their parents. Now, there was also this really nasty element of the work restrictions, and that was what was called convict leasing. Um, so once the slave codes were removed and blacks were subject to the criminal justice system, we have to understand that the whole prison system had been destroyed by the Civil War. And there was never an intention that 4 million people were going to be absorbed into into the old criminal justice system. And so there's this tremendous need for cheap labor and for control. And so if you couldn't pay the fine of vagrancy, you could end up being put into what they called convict leasing. And basically, what they did was they leased out convicts. Instead of putting them in jail, but they didn't have enough prison space, they would say, all right, you can't pay your fine. You have to work your fine off by working for somebody a plantation owner. And so it saved the state money, it made the state money, and it provided labor to people. And a lot of times it took forever, sometimes years, for a freed slave to work off their vagrancy fine. This practice of convict leasing didn't end until Alabama outlawed it in 1928, the last state to outlaw this practice. So there are also social restrictions associated with the black codes. The beginnings of segregation are put in place. This is a segregated Texas elementary school in the 1900s. Uh, Within these social restrictions, they segregated who got relief from poverty relief through agencies. They segregated orphanage. They segregated parks, schools. North Carolina got rid of their public schools because they didn't want black and white kids to go to school together and established private academies only for white children. Other public facilities were segregated. Now, this is not the full-blown segregation that we're going to see develop in coming decades, but it is the beginning of segregation. And there are other forms of social control. Some black codes said that slaves had to labor, or freed slaves had to labor from sunup to sundown. They banned leaving the plantation without permission, and entertaining guests without permission. You have to have permission to leave. You had permission to have people come visit you. There were laws against disobedience, what they called impudence, disrespect, insulting gestures, malicious mischief, preaching without a license. Blacks in some places were forbidden to rent land in a city. And in some places they were told you can't hunt or fish, and you're not allowed to own a weapon. So if you really think about this, these laws are designed to separate, to create control, but they're also in some ways designed to keep freed blacks from becoming independent and self-reliant. The hunting and fishing in particular. We need, in the South, Southerners viewed this as we need freed blacks for labor. We need to have control over them. And so we are going to limit their ability to be independent of us. A really, really problematic and sobering aspect of the Black Codes. So the Black Codes enforcement, you have to understand that blacks had almost no voice in society. The whites made up the urban police forces and the state militias. They controlled the apparatus of the criminal justice system. Blacks were barred from jury service. They don't have a voice there. Law enforcement, because of the situation, was very reluctant to prosecute whites when they violated the rights of a black person. And sentences for whites were often more lenient than for blacks. Again, back to what Picault said about who has the institutional power. White Southerners had the institutional power. Now, we really need to understand that the Black Codes are going to have a sort of odd duration. Some of them are going to disappear very quickly as far as in law itself, especially once radical Reconstruction begins to take place. But a lot of times what they did was they just removed the word black from the law, but still applied the law itself primarily to blacks. And it's important also to note that many of the black codes that were abandoned were then later reinstituted after the collapse of Reconstruction in the 1870s. So the third part of our conversation looks at the rise of black churches. And so I want to ask this question, why black churches? So we've seen the president's position on a free biracial society and the issue of equality. We've seen the white Southerners respond to freedom with the black codes. How's the church going to respond? What is the church going to look like in freedom? And it's very fascinating to me is that the way the church looked like, or what the church ended up looking like, was segregated churches, and not by choice. Why did we end up with black churches? Why did white and black Americans agree that the best way to move forward was to have separate churches? Henry Nouwen wrote in his book Compassion, when we take a critical look at ourselves, we have to recognize that competition, not compassion, is our main motivation in life. We find ourselves deeply immersed in all sorts of competition. Our whole sense of self is dependent upon the way we compare ourselves with others and upon the differences we can identify. It does not take much reflection to realize that in all family problems, race conflicts, class confrontations, and national and international disputes, these real or imaginary distinctions play a central role. Indeed, we invest much of our energy in defending the differences between people and groups of people. Thus, we define ourselves in ways that require us to maintain distance from one another. I think Nouwen really speaks well to this situation. People are naturally in competition with each other. In this situation, we have a situation in which the institutional power is in the hands of white Americans. It was true then, It's still true now. They are going to shape the society that they are comfortable with. And many white Americans do not believe in racial equality. That's just the reality. In fact, most white Americans at this time overwhelmingly did not believe in racial equality. And so they have the power. And this competition for power is going to result in the ultimate solution being we're just going to have two different churches. We're going to have black churches and white churches because distance is the only solution to this problem of competition. So we have the rise of the black church and the reasons for it. There are some really, really good reasons. Three we're going to highlight. One is having your own church, having a church, a congregation that is your own, is a symbolic expression of freedom. It is the opportunity to say, I'm free. I don't have to go to church where you tell me to go to church. I can go to my own church. It's an expression of freedom. It's also the refusal to accept a lower status in a white church. It's saying, I'm not going to go to a church where I have to sit in a particular pew or where I can't vote or hold office or be a pastor. So it's a refusal to accept a lower status. And then thirdly, it is a disconnect. It is an expression of the disconnect with the message of the white church. That message we have talked about previously of duty and obedience and loyalty to the slave owner, of a subservient culture. That disconnect with that message, Black Americans are looking for a new message, a different message than the one that the white church had offered to them. One of the more fascinating aspects of history is to see and understand the enormous growth of the Black church after slavery ended. And this first response to freedom of forming Black churches and flocking to them, and from those churches becoming central to the Black community. It's a fascinating thing to see that happen, to see white Southerners Christianize their slaves in interracial congregations with that message of duty, obedience, and loyalty, and then to have freed slaves, Black Americans, still embrace the Christian message itself in general, in the broader context. And so you have, by their choice now, in freedom, Black Americans flocking to Black churches, creating those institutions, and then flocking to them. And so you see the growth of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, which was formed in 1816, but just expands throughout the country after slavery in a really significant way. You have the growth of the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church, had been formed in 1820, again, now explosive growth. And then you have the formation in 1886 of the National Baptist Convention and the explosion of the Black Baptist Church. These are the three largest, most significant denominational bodies that emerged. Fascinating that membership increased from about 11% of Black Americans to 43% of Black Americans being part of a church. And again, this idea of your own institution, this idea of freedom of expression, and this embrace of Christianity in freedom, a really important part of our story. So I want to just take a second and say, why was this so popular? Why was this something that, why did this happen? Again, it's an institution that exclusively belonged to Black Americans. That's important. The Black church provided opportunity for self-expression, for recognition, and it provided leadership opportunities. It also was in itself an agency for self-help. It was a way to bring support and help to other members within the Black community. It was a way to maintain group cohesion in extremely difficult circumstances that followed the Civil War. And it fostered a sense of self-respect and independence, and had just so many positive elements associated with it as an institution. So in this conversation, we have looked at the first response to freedom. We have looked at how presidents responded to freedom with a lenient Reconstruction plan that said we are going to demand freedom, demand end of slavery, but we're not going to demand anything with regard to equality. And then we have Southerners responding. White Southerners who had that institutional power, we have them responding with the black codes, and we looked at the reasons for those codes and the rights that were gained, and then the work and social restrictions associated with them, and how they were enforced and the duration. But the key point there is that white Southerners decided to create a separate criminal justice system for black Americans. That was their answer. That was their first response to freedom. Then we have the response of the church. We have the rise of the black church and the decision that was made that both white and Southern black, both white and black Americans agreed to, which was the idea that the best path forward was two separate churches, a black church and a white church. Segregation still exists today in America. The American church is segregated in a very significant way even today, and we could see the positive effects of this institution of the black church and the value of it and the important contribution. But we can also see the problems associated with making this decision as far as the interaction of the races, and ultimately the healing of the relationship between the races that we need to have in this country. Some questions to consider from this conversation on the first response to freedom. What are the moral implications of presidential reconstruction? This plan for freedom but not equality that our presidents put forward at this time. Secondly, what does the creation of the Black Codes tell us about the mindset of white Southerners on the issue of racial equality? Thirdly, describe the negative and positive aspects of the rise of the Black church. Thanks for joining this conversation today. Have a great day and God bless you.